thank you again for coming here today. My name's Honna Veerkamp, and today is Intro to Podcasting, which is the first session in a seminar that we're doing this fall. And so today we're going to be covering really just the intro and kind of basic, some background. This may be a review to some people, and it will hopefully be insightful to others. And then we'll also go over some ideas of how to develop ideas for your podcast, and then do kind of an overview of the sessions that are to come and what you can expect going forward. First of all, let's just kind of start with some of the basics, like what is a podcast? And if anybody wants to chat ideas about your first thoughts of what come to mind when we're talking about a podcast, feel free and go ahead and chat that if you'd like. There's a lot of different definitions that kind of vary for this. And essentially, I'm going to move on since I'm not seeing any chats in here. A podcast is a digital audio recording that can be shared over the internet and that can be downloaded onto a personal device for listening. And so there are also video podcasts, but for the purposes of this seminar, we're going to be focusing on audio podcasting. It can sometimes colloquially be referred to as for any kind of recording, sound recording that isn't music, but for the purposes of the seminar, I want to keep us focused kind of on the delivery aspects of the podcast. And so that means that it is consumable on demand. And that's one of the main distinctions between podcasting and traditional radio, is that people can listen whenever they like. And so because of the fact that it's not tied to specific time clocks on the broadcast schedule, it allows a lot more flexibility with the format. It also allows a lot more flexibility with whose voices can be there, because there's a lot less limited time and space. There's right now pretty unlimited places to put your podcast out for free or cheap. And so it really opens the field up to a lot more different types of voices and backgrounds. And so anything from very broad appeal to very niche appeal. So podcasting as we know it has been around since the early 2000s, and when the RSS technology was developed. So RSS is the feed that sends your podcast to allow people to download it. Audio blogging dates back even further, though, clear back to the 80s, and that's kind of a precursor for podcasting. The term podcasting relates to Apple iPods, which were some of the first devices to be able to download podcasts, and it was coined by a journalist for The Guardian named Ben Hammersley. So when we're talking about the landscape of podcasting for this seminar, we are going to be focusing primarily on US podcast landscape, but it is a global phenomenon. The popularity has been steadily growing over the past 15 years. And in 2019 was the first time that in this country, more than half of the population had listened to at least one podcast before. Previously, a lot of people didn't even know what podcasts were. And that's still true to some degree, but it's really increasing in popularity. There are a huge variety of programs and topics that are available, ranging from pop culture, news, storytelling, and then into very, very specific audiences. So I want to talk about the demographics, and again, this is primarily in the US. Historically, the largest listenership has been roughly middle-aged, young to middle-aged listeners. But recently, and again, this is from a report from last year, and this is from the Edison Podcast Consumer Report, which I'll link at the end if you want to follow up on that. But last year, younger listeners in the 12 to 24 group took the lead and actually were about 40% of the overall listeners. And so the largest demographic of listeners. And so that's a shift that's happening. There are slightly more men than women who listen to podcasts, and slightly more than half of US listeners are educated, white, and middle class, but diversity across all of the sectors is steadily increasing. And it's steadily increasing in the host as well, and production, but still currently only 20% of podcast hosts are women. And so your voice and your perspective are unique, they're important, and we want to have your ideas. And so we're going to look a little bit about how to start generating ideas. And I want to share an exercise from Entrepreneur on Fire, which is a podcast that also offers podcasting tutorials. And so if you want to take a minute and get out a piece of paper, if you have one, find a scratch paper. You could do this on a computer too, but I want you to divide into 2 columns. And I want you to write passion on the top of one column and then experience on the top of the other column. And so we're going to just take a few minutes and jot down. I'm going to actually set a timer, and I want you guys to just take a few minutes and jot down as many things as you can think about in each of those categories. And then we're going to kind of use those to generate some ideas. So I wish that I had the hand button. Can you guys see the, in the toolbar, you should have some reactions. Can you guys give me a reaction, like a thumbs up or an emoji, to let me know if you guys are doing that? Okay, cool. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to set the timer for 3 minutes, and then we're going to talk about that, and we can either talk out loud or we can chat about that afterwards. But go ahead and just try to keep writing. Even if you think you're out of ideas, try to just keep on writing more. And go ahead and start on that. So now when you have that list, I want you to circle topics that stand out as possible podcast ideas and pay special attention to the topics that you see on both of the lists or where there's overlap. And just take another 30 seconds or so to just look at the list and see if anything jumps out. And then if anybody could share ideas that came to them, and you're welcome to unmute yourself and speak, or if you prefer to use a chat, that's fine. You don't have to raise your hand or anything. Just feel free to join the conversation and share if you have anything that you'd like to share from that exercise. This is a really simple exercise, but sometimes it brings up ideas that you might not have thought about. Did anybody have ideas come up that kind of surprised them when they started writing? Or that they hadn't thought about it as a possible topic or idea, but is something that they realize that comes to mind when they think about their passion or experience and expertise?
Hi, this is Tony.
Hi, Tony.
Hi. I would like to say that I hadn't really put this together before, but with all of the recent news events with Black Lives Matter and statistics that come out about how far behind the African American community is as it relates to building wealth and having equitable, terms with other people, I thought financial literacy for basically that disenfranchised group, giving some really good practical tips. And I related that to, I've been in financial services for about 20 years. So right. That would be something that could be put together.
So yeah, you have that expertise and then also that passion and interest. Great examples. Thank you so much. And someone is sharing in the chat that they have a lot of topics in both columns centered around government transparency, community engagement and development, and looking at all on paper, it fits nicely together. Yeah, sometimes doing this exercise brings up connections that you might not have noticed previously. Another participant says, my ideas could work for one podcast topic, but they wouldn't work together for an ongoing theme. Do you feel like sharing what some of those topics are that don't necessarily work together as a theme, so that we can see if we can identify some connections that you might not be noticing? And if anybody else,
my topics were just totally random things. Like I'm really passionate about resilience because of some of the concussions that I've been through, but I don't want that to be something that I talk about for a year or whatever. I'm really passionate about running, but I think there's probably, more podcasts on running than we could possibly need. I'm passionate about conflict management, or I'm passionate about the opposite of cooking, whatever that is.
That's an intriguing idea right there. What is that?
I like not cooking, but so I have a lot of ideas, but not one coherent way to sell them.
Yeah, it does, and you bring up a great point that one of the hardest things I think is figuring out kind of a nutshell that is specific enough to give focus, and then also broad enough to keep you interested. And so someone in the chat is saying that they also love the opposite of cooking. I think that that's a really intriguing thing. And I noticed just from hearing some of the topics you mentioned that they seem to be related to health, not necessarily the not cooking one, but maybe there is a relation to that as well. Does anybody else have, just hearing Julie's ideas, does anybody else have things that come to mind of how those things might fit together? And they might not all fit together, but that's giving you kind of a direction at least.
I have some thoughts on that, because when I had started my podcast, I'm passionate about a lot of like political topics, things about mental health, anything, lots and lots of very different things. So I guess the thing that brought all the episodes together was talking about things that are controversial and, working through those conversations that are more difficult to have. So like maybe the ideas don't have to all be the same. Like you could differ in each episode, but having just one overarching theme, I guess, in all of your podcast episodes would be a good way to solve that problem.
I think you've both hit on it. I think the theme that I would have that really resonates for me is the idea of health and wellness.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And does anyone else have any specifics they want to share from this? I want to keep on this conversation, but move on to develop it a little bit more. Somebody in the chat is sharing about ideas about travel, pop culture, local tourism. And so once we get some of these basic ideas or themes, then we need to kind of take it into something more specific. And then from there, the idea is to move into an elevator pitch, which many of you may be familiar with, but the idea being that a succinct, persuasive summation of what you're trying to talk about, and the idea that somebody could deliver in the time of a short elevator ride. According to urban legend, like if an executive got in the elevator at the same time as you and you only had till the 10th floor to deliver your pitch, what would you say? And so thinking about that, you want to start to think more specific too. Think about format, thinking about like what kinds of perspective you're going to have, what kind of premises was going to be, how you're going to tell that. And so there's a great book that is available at the library. I will link to it. Oh, you can't see it because I have a virtual background. That's funny. By the way, the virtual background behind me is a picture of the recording room at Central. So You Want to Start a Podcast by Kristen Meinzer is a really great kind of nuts and bolts book. And we have it at the library on both paper and audio and ebooks. And so I've linked to that at the end. But she gives some examples about how to kind of hone into making more topics into more specific ideas. So the example is like, think about, instead of a podcast about movies, then an elevator pitch might be a podcast in which a film critic interviews a real person each week who's lived the same experience as a character in a newly released film. And so this is like taking that to the next level of thinking about how you want to approach it. So for example, the topic of health, and then Julie has mentioned some of the specifics in there that are of interest, but then how to move that into like, what is Julie's unique take on that, of how it would be presented, what guests there might be. We can also start thinking about audience here, but we'll move on to that a little bit more specifically. And so I think that we have enough time to just take a few minutes again, and again, like 3 minutes. And if you want to just start jotting down, just kind of from the top of your head, how you might take some of the topics that you've come up with and just make it into a 2-sentence idea of a specific show. And again, this is something that will probably be something you're going to want to work on in more depth at home. You may want to do longer free writes and try to write it out and then distill it into a couple of sentences. But just for an exercise, let's give it a try and see what you come up with, even if it sounds like a totally crazy idea. And then we can share some of them and respond. So feel free to put things in the chat as you feel free to put names in the chat or put ideas in the chat as you go, or we'll share them out loud in just a couple of minutes. So I realize this is hard to take a topic and try to get it down into a succinct elevator pitch in just a few minutes, but does anybody have any starts of ideas that you would like to share?
Hi, this is Jan.
Hi.
I'll share if it's, but I'm not sure it has any real value, but I'll share it.
Thank you.
I happen to have had a career in computer programming, and computer technology, as we know, of course, has exploded over the last 50 to 75 years. But there are still programmers like me alive today who were engaged in programming during what I call the Wild West of programming, back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, when a computer filled a room rather than rested in your hand.
Yeah.
And experiences are pretty extraordinary. So to get those recorded might be of interest to the, from a historical point of view, if from no other point of view.
That's a great idea. I would love to hear those stories. And I know that there were a lot of women in those who were early in the programming field. And I think that is, that's fascinating. Somebody in the chat says that they'd listen to that podcast.
Cool.
How would you approach it? So that is, I think that's a great idea. But then in terms of like, who would the host be? Who would your guest be? What would it sound like? How long would it be? Just off the top of your head, obviously you're going to think of those, but like what comes to mind when you envision it?
Well, I think initially I would be the host, and I think that I would maybe begin by digging into my own list of acquaintances from the field to see if I can find some of these old folks that were there when I was there, and telling stories. Storytelling has a lot to do with it. But I think eventually, too, it would have to include some research, right? I'd have to go to the libraries and look into things and maybe do some outreach to people that I don't know. So it's, it starts to get a little overwhelming when I start thinking about those questions you just asked.
Yeah, but it sounds like you're thinking of basing it on interviews with people, or either interviews or oral histories or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Although, I don't know how else to do it. There may be some recordings out there too that would be of use. It's possible that back in the day there were videos or radio interviews that were done.
That would be really interesting.
Yeah, so might take some research too, library research.
One thing that just came to my mind when you were talking about that, and this is just one of many possible ways to approach it, so feel free to discard it if it's not of interest, but it just struck me like, what would it be like to either do a show or possibly even have a co-host who is a programmer contemporarily, who's a younger programmer today, who's working in the field, and to approach it, talking about that experience between your perspective on computer programming and somebody who's coming up today in computer programming, and maybe even talk to programmers today as well as programmers from who started around the time that you did, and just maybe even just for one show, if not an ongoing thing, but I'd be really interested in hear that kind of contrast as well.
I love that idea, actually, because that would be part of the motivation, would be to try to tie it together with what we have today. I mean, it's when I look back on what things were like, it's just amazing, the difference that in the environment, the internet exploded in those 50 years. I mean, we didn't have that. Although when my initial experience in the field, we did communicate across the entire Midwest, the first computer system I worked on, but it was all done on telephone lines.
It's fascinating.
So thank you for helping me organize.
You're very welcome. Does anybody else have any thoughts about the idea that Jan shared, or want to share an idea that came to you? Your either one of those. So this is something that definitely takes more time, and thank you for sharing, Jan. It's something that I offer you to just kind of be thinking about, and then trying to just hone the idea down as more and more as you can. First, kind of center in on a topic, and then think about the way that you want to approach it, the format, think about the different shows that you like and that you don't like, and then try to see if you can get it down into 1 to 2 sentences. In the chat, we have a travel podcast where the host and guest present the travel location and their experiences at the location or the background of it. Yeah, I love that idea. And so thinking about that idea, then yeah, I'm curious like how the show would actually play for a listener. So would they actually be there in this place and do this on location? Would it be someplace that they have both been or they're from? Would they talk to people who are from there? So just thinking about some of those, like you start to think about the format of it, you start to think about the structure, and it can change. It doesn't have to always be the same each time, but giving yourself some parameters to work in sometimes I think can make it feel less overwhelming, because one of the beautiful things about podcasting is that the field is wide open in a lot of ways, but then that I personally find that can be overwhelming as well. Once you kind of come up with an idea and get it more and more succinct, then Kristen Meinzer and I would agree, recommend sharing this elevator pitch with as many people as you can, and then you can sort of adapt it based on their feedback. And then someone else is saying in the chat that they love that travel idea. Personal experience with travel locations can be very enticing for the listener. I agree with that, because I know if I'm trying to go someplace, I want to hear a personal experience about what it's like to be there. And particularly, this can relate to, certain demographics as well. So like, I'm interested in knowing that, I tend to travel on a budget. So I'm more interested in the experience of somebody else who is traveling on a budget than somebody who is staying in 5-star hotels or something like that. I'm interested in the kind of things that might not be as easy to find, so things like that. I think that there are definitely ways that you can tweak that are true to your personal interest and experience. So then I have another exercise that's going to be kind of homework, because I want to move through and have questions for this. But another exercise that this author that I mentioned and a lot of other podcast producers recommend is coming up with kind of your ideal listener. And so this is not intended to be your only listener or your demographic. This is just an exercise to have somebody real that you can imagine listening to your show that kind of gives you an idea of how a listener might respond, and is sort of a stand-in. And so this is something that you can do on your own, and I'll share this slideshow with you after the workshop. But think about, and this can either be an actual person, this can be like your best friend, this can be like somebody that you went to school with, this can be your kid's friend, somebody you know, or it can be somebody that you completely make up. But try to be as specific as you can. Give them a name, a job, an occupation, an age. If you can't hone it down to just one, you can do a couple of people, but trying to just think of one or two people who might be listening just can make it more real to think about who is going to respond. And again, this doesn't have to be the only person that's listening. It doesn't mean that this is the only people that your show is for. It's just an idea to kind of give it down a little, give it more specific. And then write that out and write out a narrative of who they are, what they're listening to, and do it in the present tense, because that sort of makes it feel more real. Like, this is what they do every day. This is what, when they listen, this is what they like. This is what they hate when I do this thing. And so this can kind of just be a creative way to keep you focusing in on as you develop and hone that. And then you can kind of go back and forth between the elevator pitch and honing it down, and then doing this ideal listener. And then this is also someone that you can have this writing and pull it back out. Like if you're thinking of a certain episode, and think about how this will appeal to your ideal listener. So I'm going to move on just kind of to do a quick overview and things that are coming up with the podcast, and then we'll open it up for general questions. If there's any specific questions before I move on, feel free to shout them out or say them in the chat. I just want to give kind of a quick overview of the nuts and bolts of what goes into making a podcast once you have your idea. And then these topics are going to be, we're going to be addressing them in the upcoming seminars. So we'll get more into the technical and kind of hands-on stuff with some of that, but just want to kind of go over some of those points. So usually a podcast starts with clear, well-edited interviews and recordings. So we'll be doing some practice with that. A lot of times people use software that we have available in Creative Experience. We also have the microphones and computer workstation. So some of the programs that we offer and that you might use are Pro Tools or Adobe Audition. Audacity is a free open source program that a lot of people have access to at home. You can use it on any platform, so that's a great option as well. And I'm seeing a couple questions in chats, and I'll come back to that. So those resources are available to you at Creative Experience, or a lot of them on your own, and we'll be talking about that. After you create the file and then edit it down, it's exported as an MP3, which is kind of a compressed file type, but it's what we're all used to listening to most music and podcasts on. And then that includes metadata like the title and the episode and things like that. And that's how that stuff appears when you look at your phone and you see the name of the show. That's how that appears. Those get uploaded to a hosting site, which there are a few different options for that, and we'll have a seminar where we talk specifically about those. There are some free options, or some that charge anywhere between $5 to $15 a month. And this is where your actual files get hosted. And so part of what they offer for their services is also to create this RSS feed. RSS stands for really simple syndication, and basically it's what allows people to find the file in the directories. And so that's the next step. Once you host it to your site, and then you register with different directories like Google Play or Apple or Stitcher, there's a number of different ones, then people can find those there. And then there's a lot of other ones that automatically get their feeds from the big ones. So you don't necessarily have to sign up for every one. And once you've done that, you don't have to do anything with them each month. They automatically get your content each time that you create a new episode. Those are usually separate from the hosting sites, but in some cases there's overlap. So again, we'll talk about both of those things in a whole seminar. And then after that, listeners download the podcast from their devices. And then beyond that is about building the audience and creating community around it and just getting the word out. So we'll be talking about a lot of these things in upcoming seminars. Before we go on to some of those that are coming up, I just wanted to share some of the resources that I've mentioned and let you know that we will be sharing this. We'll email you this slideshow after the presentation if you are either attending or if you were on a wait list. If you didn't attend and are watching this later on a video and you would like to have this slideshow, email us at the contact at the end and we'll send it out to you too. Creative experience, as I mentioned, is where we're coming from. So I'm just going to take click on there and I'll show you our webpage. This is on the St. Louis Public Library webpage. And there's a lot of FAQs here. We will be updating our website very soon, but along the sidebar, you can see the different virtual events that are coming up. And this will be recorded, so you'll be able to find this on YouTube again later on. And while I'm on the library's webpage, I just want to point out that at the top we have this. Can somebody give me a little thumbs up if you're seeing the library's website? Yeah. Okay. Cool. I wasn't sure if you're still seeing my page. So I'm going to go under to the digital content heading, and then we have these online learning here. And this is a great resource for all kinds of stuff, but specifically I want to point out Creative Bug, Gale courses, and lynda.com, which all have a lot of resources for podcasting and for recording and for interviewing, all kinds of things. Lynda.com, which is also called LinkedIn Learning, is a resource that usually is by subscription, but if you sign on through the library using your library's library card, then you can access it for free. And there's hundreds of tutorials. And so you can look up anything like a specific audio editing program or just podcasting, something like that. And then also, while we're on the website, if you go down to the very bottom, this is where you can find creative experience if you didn't get there directly. And then I also want to mention that Your Library Podcast is there. And so Your Library Podcast is also available on Apple and Google Play and Stitcher and SoundCloud and possibly some other ones as well. This is a periodic podcast that Mary and I produce here. And so we try to just cover library events, resources, people, all kinds of things. So please check it out and send us an email. Let us know what you think. So I just want to run through a couple more of these resources. This book that I mentioned, So You Want to Start a Podcast, you can find in our card catalog. And the podcast consumer report is also linked here. And then finally, I've included this people of color and audio directory that you may found useful. It's just a really great resource either for connecting with other people of color or finding people of color that if you have a job to offer and that sort of thing. So just a resource that is one of the things people are trying to do to increase diversity in podcasting. And then the upcoming seminar sessions that we have, this is the Intro to Podcasting. Next month, we will be doing interviewing and recording. The month after that, in October, we'll be doing editing and music. And then in November, we have advanced mixing techniques where we'll talk about adding EQ and compression and that sort of thing. And then in December, we'll be doing hosting, distribution, and promotion. And so you're welcome to attend one or all of these. You don't have to attend all of them, and they will be available on video. And I realize we're getting close on time, so I'm going to open it up for questions now, and I'm able to stay a little bit longer if people want to stick around beyond noon if there are still questions. And we'll go ahead and keep the recording going with the questions to start. And if you want to ask questions after I turn off the recording, that is an option too. So feel free to unmute yourself or just put questions in the chat. One was asking if they're able to review the program, and yes, it will be on YouTube. There may be a little bit of delay till we get it in there. We also had a question about how long you should expect your podcast to live, 1 year or more. And it kind of is up to you. I mean, you can take it down from the internet if you find that it's not relevant and you don't want it to be there anymore. But a lot of times once people start listening to a program, they want to go back and listen to the back programs and get an idea of what some of the other ones are. And that's also something that we'll get into talking about when we're looking at the things to consider with hosting, because some hosting sites have limitations on how much content you can have. And so you have to think about how long you want it to live up there. And then someone's asking about the best way to determine how long to make your podcast, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, etc. There's a lot of debate on that, of how long a podcast should be. I think that it really just depends on the format, the content, and how long you can keep listeners engaged. And so I would say there are not a lot of podcasts. I would say most podcasts do fall into that range. I would say between like maybe 10 minutes to an hour or something. There are some much shorter ones. There are a few longer ones, but most of them, a lot of times people think about commute time. And of course that depends on different thing for different people. But I think somewhere in the 20 minutes to 60 minutes range is a good target. But then also just thinking about what you have to say that is still succinct and engaging. If anybody else has any specific thoughts about that, feel free to jump in. And any other questions? Thank you all so much for being here.